A protester tried to knock down the pedestals. John Lennon did this, and the entire stadium shut up. London, June 1968. Wembley Stadium. The vast, iconic arena, usually a cathedral of celebration, felt different tonight. Charged, fractured. A building holding within its walls the specific volatile tension of a country arguing with itself. The air was thick with the competing smells of summer rain, cigarette smoke, due in the particular electricity of 20,000 people who had not all come for the same reason. John Lennon stood in the wings, his guitar hanging at his side, his eyes closed. He was not meditating. He was listening. He had always been a listener before a performer. He heard things in crowds that other people missed. The temperature beneath the noise. The thing the cheering was built on top of. Tonight, what he heard beneath the noise was fracture. 1968 was not a gentle year. Anywhere in the world, but particularly in Britain. The streets of London had seen protests, marches, confrontations between students and police that left marks on the city's consciousness that would not heal quickly. The Vietnam War divided families at dinner tables. The civil rights movement in America sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. The comfortable certainties of the post-war decade were crumbling, and nobody quite agreed on what should be built in their place. The concert tonight had been organized as a benefit for a coalition of peace organizations. A gathering of artists committed to using their platform to speak against war, against inequality, against the systems of power that crushed the ordinary human being beneath the weight of their own indifference. John had agreed to perform without hesitation. He believed in the cause, with the specific conviction of someone who had examined it from every angle and arrived at the same answer every time. But the event had attracted something beyond its intended audience. Word had spread through London's most volatile protest networks that this concert, with its high-profile performers and its packed stadium, offered an opportunity. Not just to celebrate peace, but to make a point that went beyond music, beyond singing, beyond the polite gesture of a benefit concert. A group of hardcore protesters, disillusioned with what they called the comfortable pacifism of celebrity activism, and had organized inside the venue. Approximately 40 of them scattered through the crowd, connected by a plan that had been discussed in cramped flats and back rooms across East London for weeks. Their leader was a young man named Daniel Marsh, 23 years old, intense, genuinely passionate about injustice in a way that had curdled, through a combination of frustration and radicalization, into something more destructive than constructive. Daniel had started as an idealist. He had marched for civil rights, had pressed leaflets into the hands of strangers on cold mornings, had written letters to members of parliament that were never answered. Each unanswered letter had hardened something in him. Each ignored march had calcified his belief that peaceful means were insufficient, that what was needed was disruption. Visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. His plan tonight was simple. During John Lennon's performance, at a prearranged signal, when the group would rush the stage, knock over the speaker pedestals, tear down the backdrop banners, and occupy the stage with their own banners and chants. In the chaos, it would be impossible for the concert to continue. The story the next morning would not be about John Lennon performing a benefit concert for peace. It would be about the protesters who interrupted it, about their message, about the disruption that was impossible to ignore. Daniel believed this was the right thing to do. He believed it with the certainty of someone very young and very angry and very, very tired of being polite. He did not know that John Lennon, standing in the wings, listening to the crowd with his eyes closed, had already sensed that something was wrong. He did not know that the man he was about to disrupt was the most experienced reader of audiences on the planet. A man who had spent 15 years learning with absolute precision the difference between energy that was with him and energy that was gathering against him. He did not know that John Lennon had already decided, before he ever walked onto that stage, exactly how he was going to respond. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary, least documented evenings in Wembley Stadium's long history. A moment where the intended disruption became, in the hands of its intended target, something no protester, no concert organizer, no music critic, and no government surveillance officer had anticipated. A protester tried to knock down the pedestals, and John Lennon did something that made the entire stadium shut up. To understand what John Lennon did that June night in Wembley, you have to understand what 15 years of performing had built inside him. Not the techniques, not the stagecraft, not the 1,000 professional habits that any successful performer accumulates over a career. Something else. Something rarer and more difficult to describe. John Lennon had developed, through a combination of natural instinct and hard-won experience, the ability to read the emotional truth of a room. Not the surface truth, not what people were willing to show, the truth beneath, the needs and fears and angers and griefs that people carried into performance spaces and projected, without knowing they were doing it, onto everything that happened on stage. He had learned this in the Cavern Club in Liverpool, playing to audiences who were too close to pretend to be anything other than exactly what they were. He had refined it through the years of Beatlemania, where reading a crowd correctly was sometimes the difference between a transcendent night and genuine danger. He had deepened it in his solo work, where the absence of the band's collective energy meant he had to carry the connection between performer and audience entirely alone. By 1968, John Lennon could walk into a room and tell you within minutes exactly what it needed. What Wembley Stadium needed that June night was honesty, not performance, not the carefully constructed emotional journey of a well-planned concert set, not the diplomatic gestures of a celebrity activist. Honesty, the raw, unmediated, completely human kind, the kind that doesn't protect itself behind craft or distance or the performer's professional armor. John had understood this the moment he heard the crowd's particular temperature beneath the noise. He had heard the protesters in it, not because he could identify them individually, but because their presence altered the emotional frequency of the room in a way his 15 years of listening had made unmistakable. He had heard anger masquerading as enthusiasm, disruption gathering itself in the spaces between cheers, a plan organizing itself beneath the surface of apparent celebration. Lennon standing in the wings, his guitar at his side, his eyes closed, he had made a decision. Not about what to do if they rushed the stage. He had decided something more fundamental and more difficult than that. He had decided to tell the truth about everything, to go out onto that stage and refuse the armor, to say the things that performers, particularly famous performers at benefit concerts, were supposed to leave unsaid, the complicated things, the self-implicating things, the things that acknowledged not just the injustice in the world, but the specific, uncomfortable ways in which his own position contributed to it. He understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a man who had been both poor and obscenely wealthy, that the protesters' anger had a legitimate target underneath its misdirected method, that the critique at the heart of Daniel Marsh's plan was not entirely wrong. Celebrity activism was comfortable. It was safe. It raised money and raised awareness, but it did not raise the cost of the activism to the people performing it. A benefit concert was by its nature a transaction in which everyone involved, the performers, The organizers, the audience, could feel good about themselves without fundamentally changing anything about their lives. John Lennon knew this. He had known it for years, and it had been a source of private discomfort that his public statements carefully skirted. Tonight, and he had decided to stop skirting it. Tonight, whatever happened, he was going to say it out loud. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, unleave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon walked onto the Wembley Stadium stage alone. No band, no introduction, no choreographed lighting sequence building to a dramatic reveal. And just a man in a white suit walking into the glare of 20,000 people with a guitar and no apparent plan for the next 30 seconds. The crowd, expecting the usual concert opening, the count-in, the first chord, the signal to begin, was momentarily confused. The cheering faltered, replaced by a murmur of anticipation. John walked to the center of the stage. He stood at the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, with that particular quality of attention that had always made people feel, even in the furthest seats of the largest venues, that he was looking specifically at them. He did not play. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked. For 7 seconds, which felt in the context of Wembley Stadium like an extraordinarily long time, John Lennon stood at the microphone in complete silence and looked at 20,000 people. And in those 7 seconds, something happened that no one could have scripted. The crowd, uncertain and attentive, became very quiet. They're not the quiet of a crowd that has been directed towards silence. The quiet of a crowd that has been made curious by something it doesn't understand. Daniel Marsh, positioned near the front of the stage with 11 members of his group, his hand holding the rope that would signal the rush, watched this with growing unease. This was not how concerts started. This was not the conventional opening against which his planned disruption had been designed to operate. He held the signal. John opened his mouth. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, intimate, the voice of a man having a conversation, rather than addressing an arena. "I've been trying to figure out what to say tonight," John said. "And I've been standing in those wings for 20 minutes, telling myself I know exactly what to say. And now I'm out here, and I don't know if I do." The crowd was absolutely still. "There are people in this room tonight," John continued, his eyes moving slowly across the assembled faces, "who came here to hear me sing about peace, and I'm going to do that. But there are also people in this room who came here because they think that me, standing on this stage, singing about peace, is part of the problem." The murmur that moved through the crowd was not hostile. It was the sound of recognition. "And I've been thinking about whether they're wrong," John said. "And I haven't come to a conclusion I'm entirely comfortable with." Daniel Marsh's hand loosened on the rope. The silence that followed John's last words was of a quality that Wembley Stadium had never produced before. 20,000 people united not by celebration or excitement, but by the specific, rare silence of people who have just heard someone say something true that they didn't expect to hear. John looked down at his guitar for a moment, then back at the crowd. "I live in a very expensive flat," he said. "I have more money than I know what to do with. I flew here tonight in a car that costs more than most people in this country will earn in 3 years." He paused. and I'm going to stand on this stage and sing you songs about inequality, and then I'm going to go home to my expensive flat." The crowd was absolutely motionless. "Now," John said, "some of you think that makes everything I say worthless, that the contradiction between what I preach and what I live invalidates the message. And I want you to know that I hear that. I've been hearing it for years, and the honest answer is that I don't have a clean response to it." He looked directly at the area of the crowd where Daniel Marsh and his group stood. Not because he could identify them, but because his 15 years of reading rooms had told him exactly where the organized disruption was gathering itself. "I know there are people here tonight who came to make a point about that," John said quietly, "about comfortable activism, and about the absurdity of rich performers staging benefit concerts as if that were the same as actual sacrifice." The rope in Daniel Marsh's hand went completely slack. "Come and make your point," John said. The crowd stirred, not in alarm, in astonishment. "I mean it," John continued, his voice still calm, still intimate, still carrying to every corner of the vast arena through the extraordinary cooperation of a crowd that had stopped breathing. "If you came here tonight to say something, say it. This is your stage as much as mine. More than mine, probably. I'm just the one with the guitar." He stepped back from the microphone, an unmistakable gesture. The stage, for this moment, was open. What happened next was something that Daniel Marsh, in 30 years of subsequent interviews, always struggled to describe with adequate precision. He found that he could not move, not because of security, not because of physical obstacle, because John Lennon had just said, in front of 20,000 people, the thing that Daniel's entire plan had been designed to force him to confront, had said it voluntarily, had said it with more honesty and more self-implication than any protest banner or rush stage or knocked-over pedestal could have demanded. The argument for disruption required a target that was defending itself, that was pretending to be something it wasn't, that needed to be exposed. John Lennon had just exposed himself, and there was nothing left to knock over. The silence stretched. Daniel Marsh stood frozen. His group exchanged glances, their plan dissolving in real time, its essential logic dismantled by the one response they had not prepared for. John waited at the back of the stage, his guitar at his side, genuinely giving the floor to whoever chose to take it. Nobody moved. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a single voice called out. Not a protest, a question. So what do we do?" John walked back to the microphone. He looked in the direction the voice had come from. "I don't know," he said simply. "I genuinely don't know, and I think pretending I do is part of what's wrong." He sat down on the edge of the stage. The familiar gesture, the deliberate lowering of the performer's elevation, the choice to meet the audience at the nearest possible approximation of eye level. "I know that singing about peace is not the same as making peace. I know that raising money at a benefit concert is not the same as dismantling the systems that create the need for benefit concerts." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I know that I am a deeply imperfect vessel for any of the messages I try to carry." He looked up, his eyes sweeping the arena. "But I also know that the alternative to doing something imperfectly is doing nothing. And I can't do nothing. I've tried, and it makes me worse to be around." The crowd produced a sound that was part laughter and part something more complicated. Recognition. The specific sound of 20,000 people encountering a version of their own private experience reflected back at them from a stage. "So here's what I can offer tonight," John said, his voice quieter now, more personal. "Not answers, not a clean conscience. Not the pretense that this concert changes anything structural about the world we live in. He picked up his guitar. "Just this," he said. "Just music, which is the only honest thing I know how to give you. The only thing I can do that isn't performance. When I play, I stop pretending. When I play, whatever I am underneath everything else, that's what comes out." He looked one final time toward the area where Daniel Marsh stood, still motionless, the rope still loose in his hand. "Ah, so if you came to knock something over tonight," John said softly, "knock over the thing that tells us we have to be perfect to deserve a voice. Knock over the idea that the only people allowed to speak about injustice are the ones who've never benefited from it." He paused, "because that rule would silence everybody, and silence is the only thing that actually helps the people doing the damage." He began to play. The opening notes of "Working Class Hero" filled Wembley Stadium, raw, unpolished, carrying in its melody the specific weight of everything that had just been said. And Daniel Marsh, the young man who had come to knock down pedestals, sat down on the stadium floor and listened. The concert continued for 2 more hours. John played with a rawness that people who were present that night described differently in the years that followed, but always with the same essential word underneath the description: real. This something had been removed from the usual distance between performer and audience. The 7 minutes of unscripted honesty at the opening of the set had created conditions that the music then inhabited with unusual completeness. People were not watching a performance. They were sharing an experience. Daniel Marsh stayed for the entire concert. He and his group, their plan dissolved by the specific solvent of radical self-examination, sat in the crowd and listened. And several of them were crying by the end, not from sadness, from the particular release that comes when anger that has been held tightly for a very long time is, for one evening, given permission to soften. After the show, Daniel sought out John's road manager. He asked if it would be possible to speak briefly with John. He was prepared to be refused. He had, after all, arrived at this concert planning to disrupt it. He was not refused. John met him backstage for 20 minutes, and later offered this much. He asked me later, offered this much. He asked me what I actually wanted, not what I planned to do tonight, what I actually wanted the world to look like. And when I told him, he said, "Right, so how do we get from here to there?" Not as a rhetorical deflection. He actually wanted to talk through it. He had thoughts, real ones. Daniel paused in the interview. Now, he also told me that he thought we were both right about the same things and wrong about different things. And that was probably the most honest thing anyone in his position had ever said to me. The concert raised significant funds for the peace organizations it had been organized to support. But the story that spread through London's protest and music communities in the following weeks was not about the money or even the music. It was about the 7 minutes, the silence, the invitation, the admission that fame and wealth were not compatible with clean hands, the willingness to say that in front of 20,000 people and then keep talking anyway. For John, the night at Wembley settled something that had been unresolved in him for years, the tension between his political convictions and the very public contradictions of his life. He could not resolve that tension by pretending it didn't exist. He could not resolve it by shouting louder about the causes he believed in. He could not resolve it by attending more marches or writing more protest songs or performing more benefit concerts. He could only resolve it the way he resolved everything that mattered, by being honest about it, by naming it before someone else did, by refusing the armor. In the weeks that followed Wembley, John began working on what would become his most politically explicit material, with songs that carried within them not just the critique of the world, but the self-critique of the person offering that critique. Songs that acknowledge their own limitations while insisting on being sung anyway. Because silence, as he had told Daniel Marsh that night in the dressing room, only helps the people doing the damage. New York City, December 8th, 1980. John Lennon was murdered. In the years that followed, the accounts emerged, and the stories of who he had been when the cameras weren't running, when the platform wasn't amplified, when it was just him and another human being in a room and a choice about how to treat that human being. The night at Wembley Stadium in June 1968 was one of those stories, passed between people who were there, discussed in the particular careful way that significant things are discussed when the person at their center is no longer alive to correct the record. Now Daniel Marsh became a community organizer. He spent 30 years working in East London's most underserved neighborhoods, building the kind of slow, unglamorous, structurally significant change that benefit concerts cannot achieve and were never designed to achieve. He cited the night at Wembley consistently and specifically as the moment his understanding of activism fundamentally changed. "He taught me something I didn't want to learn," Daniel said in his final interview, given in 2009. That the people you disagree with most angrily are sometimes the people who share your values most completely, and that the difference between you is usually not about what you want, but about how frightened you are of admitting what you don't know. He paused. John Lennon stood on a stage in front of 20,000 people and said, "I don't know. I have contradictions. I am imperfect. I am going to do this anyway." I came to knock down his pedestals. He knocked down mine instead. And he did it by refusing to defend himself. Wembley Stadium still stands. Its turf has absorbed the footsteps of a century of extraordinary human endeavor. Champions and failures. Moments of grace and moments of ugliness. Somewhere in its acoustic memory, in the particular way that large spaces hold the residue of what has occurred within them, there is the echo of a June evening in 1968. A man in a white suit walking onto a stage alone. 7 seconds of silence. And then the thing that made the entire stadium shut up. Not a roar, not a performance, not the usual machinery of spectacle deployed to overwhelm the senses and produce the desired emotional response. A quiet voice saying, "I don't have clean hands. I don't have all the answers. I'm going to stand here anyway and tell you the truth about that." The protester who came to knock down the pedestals found that the pedestals were already gone, removed not by force, but by the performer's own hands, in the first 7 minutes, before the music had even started. And what remained in their absence was something no pedestal can support. Just a man, just a guitar, just the truth. And 20,000 people who came to be entertained and left having witnessed something considerably more valuable. A person refusing to pretend. In a year when pretending felt like the only available protection against the world's genuine and specific brutality, that refusal was the most radical act in the room, and more radical than knocking anything over, more disruptive than any banner, more lasting than any chant. The official records of that evening note a successful benefit concert, funds raised, performers listed, songs played. What they don't note is the 7 minutes, the silence before the music, the voice that said, "I don't know," the rope that went slack, the pedestals that were never knocked down because the man standing between them had already removed the ground they were built on. Not with force, with honesty, the only thing that has ever actually made a stadium completely shut up. The end. If this story about the radical power of public honesty, the courage of self-examination, and the extraordinary effect of refusing to defend yourself against a truth you already know moved you. Subscribe and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the most disarming thing you can do when someone tries to expose your contradictions is to expose them first. What moment in your life taught you the difference between performing conviction and actually having it? Tell us in the comments below.